What's up, everyone? Welcome to The Heroic Ethic, where to be considered a hero, you just need to follow the 3 simple rules of heroism. Don't throw the first punch, stronger every day, and at least help people when it's easy. I'm your host, Liberty Bill. So today we are going to be talking about the Lockean Proviso. And you may be asking yourself, how does that follow from nihilism and moralism that we talked about last time? Well, to explain, I need to provide a little bit of context. So the heroic ethic is my own philosophy, but I come from a philosophical tradition, the libertarian tradition. And I originally came to it through economics. I first got interested in economics as a supply-sider because I felt that they had the superior arguments to the neo-Keynesians and the neoclassicals. And in fact, I went to the college that I chose to study with Robert Mundell, the father of the supply-side movement, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing the euro and yada, yada, yada. But in the course of learning more about economics, I eventually became an Austrian because the supply-siders venerate Ludwig von Mises, and Mises is actually even more important and the father of the Austrian School of Economics. So, as I always do when I lose arguments in dialectic, I co-opt that argument and switch my position. And the Mises crowd has a theory of ethics as well, probably most clearly laid out by Murray Rothbard in his seminal Ethics of Liberty, which is still the standard to this day. There's been a little bit of work around the edges, but that's still pretty much the core of libertarian ethics. And so when I became aware of these, ethics, I started deploying it in dialectic. And while I felt, and I believe still to this day, that libertarian ethics is the closest manifestation that humanity has thus far created, it's not perfect. That's why I created the heroic ethic, which I think is better. And the reason that it's not perfect is that when I deployed it in dialectic, it would defeat almost any argument. But there were 2 objections to it that I was always quite uncomfortable with. One was pointed out by regular people who are untrained in philosophy. It's pretty easy to come up with examples where the libertarian ethics don't seem to make sense. So let me step back for a second. Libertarian ethics is built around the non-aggression principle, the NAP. And one of the premises of the non-aggression principle is self-ownership. I own my body, you own your body, everybody owns their own body. The body that the ego is directly integrated into and can control directly, right? I'm the only one that can make my hands go up and down, et cetera, et cetera. And self-ownership is extremely strong. In fact, you might recall that I incorporated into my own philosophy. But it's the core of libertarian economics and ethics. And it's a little bit problematic because normal people could come up with examples in which that didn't seem to make sense. The one that's probably most common is, well, if a guy is starving and his children are starving, is it ethical and moral for him to steal food from a rich guy? Because to most people, it makes sense that it is ethical to do that. And more formally, that argument can be called the flagpole problem, where if you imagine that you fall from a roof and you grab a flagpole by which you're hanging for your life, do you have the right to kick in a window to save your life? Because kicking in a window is aggression. Strictly speaking, the non-aggression principle would forbid that. And yet that doesn't seem to make any sense. I would kick in the window to save my life. Anyone would. I would want anyone to, right? Because it doesn't seem ethical to allow someone to die just, because he's not supposed to be able to initiate aggression against somebody's property, namely his window. So that's a pretty strong objection that normal people could come up with. And then people who are philosophically trained would roll out the is-ought dichotomy. This was an idea put forth by David Hume way back in the 1730s, I think it was, where he states that there is a sharp demarcation between is and ought, between facts and values. And he says that you cannot look at empirical facts of nature and from them emerge ethical laws or ethical principles that are about normative morality, which, as you will recall, is about what people should do. And that is a pretty strong argument against it as well. And to that, the libertarian responses are quite weak. Rothbard just says, well, sometimes you can derive an ought from an is. And then there's another school of argumentation, probably most famous by Hoppe in his argumentation ethics, which states that because we have control of our bodies and no one else does, that infers a moral right to control. And that's simply false. I mean, that's just not right. For example, if I'm dribbling a basketball down the court, it's a fact that I have control of it. But that doesn't imply that I have a moral right to dribble it, and in fact, I don't. Some other player has an equal right to try and steal the ball from me, right? So if I were to try and say, you can't steal the ball because I have direct control of the ball, and therefore that gives me a moral right of ownership to the ball, I would, say, no, and then I would dunk on you. So that's pretty problematic. And they have always irked at me. And it never changed my position, really, because even though those are tiny flaws in the argumentation, those arguments still destroyed every other argument, utilitarianism and, et cetera, et cetera. But they did always irk me. And as someone who's very serious about the philosophy, I wanted to fix it. And so that's why I ended up developing the heroic ethic. And in the course of doing so, I really got down into the nitty-gritty of John Locke. See, I told you we would bring it back around to the Lockean proviso at some point. So libertarian theory, both in economics and in ethics, is based on the work of John Locke. His second treatise of government, way back in 1689, I think it was, lays out this really elegant theory, a natural rights theory based on property rights, which takes as an assumption that we own our own bodies, and then through intermixing our labor with other natural resources, we create property, and through them we have property rights. And, from that school of thought comes libertarian economics and ethics. And so when I was trying to fix libertarian ethics by looking at Locke, I started looking at what's called the Lockean proviso. What is that? Well, at the very end of the second treatise of government, after he's laid out this entire argument about property rights based on self-ownership, he throws in a caveat at the very end called the Lockean proviso, which says, yes, you do have property rights and no one is morally allowed to interfere with them or aggress against them, but there is a proviso. You can only claim property rights to the point that you leave enough and good enough for everybody else. That doesn't fit at all. That basically comes out of nowhere. And this has been hugely problematic in libertarian theory, and they mostly deal with it by rejecting it. The standard libertarian position is that Locke is wrong in that respect, even though they accept every other aspect of Locke's property rights scheme. And the reason that Locke created the proviso was for very similar reasons that I had, which was that when people were objecting to it, they would come up with logical examples that seemed to go against his property rights scheme. Specifically, what I call the donut, where the idea is, if someone buys up all the land around, say, a community, do they have the right to prevent that community from accessing resources that they need to live? Right? Like if I don't allow water or food to cross my borders, then the people within them are going to die. That doesn't seem right. Yet by the property rights argument that Locke laid out, it seems like you can do that. And then the other major objection was, if I spit in the ocean, do I own it now? because his whole property rights theory is based on labor mixing. And that doesn't seem to make sense either, right? So at the very end of it, Locke throws in this proviso that is intended to address these types of examples that people can come up with. But it doesn't make logical sense. It doesn't follow from self-ownership. And it's been hugely problematic for libertarian ethics and economics ever since. And what I realized was that Locke was right, both in his property rights scheme and in including the proviso. It's just that he didn't know why he was right. Because there must be, as I was looking at this, it seemed to me that there must be a more fundamental principle against or from which self-ownership can be inferred in a way that the proviso makes sense. And that is why I'm going to put up a diagram on the screen. We do include self-ownership in the heroic ethic, but it's only the second principle. There is another principle that supersedes the self-ownership principle, and in fact, from which is inferred the self-ownership principle, the maximization of liberty principle. So that's what we are going to talk about tomorrow. We have finally got through all of the setup and the context and the necessary elements of any intellectual argument, and I can finally start building the argument proper. We are going to be starting with the maximization of liberty principle. I will explain how it's derived and some of the very nuanced aspects of it that we need to keep in mind. And then we will continue to build the heroic ethic from there. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. This has been The Heroic Ethic. I'm your host, Liberty Bill. See you next time.